Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Hannah Randall, and I'm the Head of Learning at Holocaust Centre North. This event is co-hosted by both Holocaust Centre North and the University of Huddersfield's Centre for History, Culture and Memory. Tonight, I am joined by Dr. Lindsay Dodd and our speaker, Mie Jensen, who will be introduced shortly. A few technical things to mention. I will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions or any issues, please put them there, and I will do what I can. And at the end, Lindsay will get to as many of your questions as possible. The talk will last around 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions at the end, and we'll finish promptly at 6 o'clock. As you heard, tonight's event is being recorded, and tomorrow you will receive a link for the recording and also a short online survey. So we'll be grateful for any feedback that you have. So our host this evening is Dr. Lindsay Dodd, as I mentioned. Lindsay is reader in Modern European History in the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Huddersfield. Her research interests include France during the Second World War, oral history, theory and practice, children in war, the history of childhood and the history of everyday life. In her new book, Feeling Memory, which I have a copy of, which has just been published by Columbia University Press, she examines the emotions of history and the way that affect theory can be used to understand the past. Thank you very much, Lindsay, for hosting, and I will hand it to you to introduce Mie.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Hannah, and thanks for that little plug of my book, but it's not about me tonight. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming along tonight. We're joined by Mie Jensen tonight. Mie is a PhD candidate in Gender and Sexuality Studies and Hebrew and Jewish Studies at University College London. And she works on the intersections between gender, sexuality and religion. And her research is exploring non-heterosexual Jewish women's lived experiences and practices in England and Israel. So her talk this evening is going to be providing us with some insights into LGBTQ plus Jewish people and their communities in England and Germany in the 20th century. And because we haven't got a lot of time tonight, without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Mie. So Mie, welcome. And I think you've got a PowerPoint which you can get up on the screen, and we look forward to listening to what you have to say to us. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you. I'm just going to put it into presentation mode. So as was just said, my name is Mie, and I'm a PhD candidate in Gender and Sexuality Studies and Hebrew and Jewish Studies at UCL. The theme of tonight is the 20th century, and while my thesis focuses predominantly on contemporary time, modern history is quite important to my work as well. So firstly, some of my participants are relatively old, some of them being in the 70s, and modern history is therefore important to their lives. And secondly, because of family heritage, such as intergenerational Holocaust trauma, which is also relevant to my research. But on top of that, I'm also very interested in queer Holocaust and anti-Semitism and trauma studies, which is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about here tonight. And I've been involved with a Holocaust course at the Western Galilee University on Holocaust innovation and entrepreneurship, where my project was to develop a queer Holocaust learning resource, since there's currently no such thing. And I'm also a part of the Foreign Ministry of the State of Israel's Holocaust project called My Story is Your Story, where young people work with a Holocaust survivor on telling their story to younger generations on social media. So I just want to clarify a couple of things about terminology before really going into my talk. Sexuality, which is the key theme of tonight for me, refers not just to genital sexual activity, but to all the attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors which might be seen to have some sort of sexual significance in our society. And LGBTQ refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer individuals. So despite the fact that this acronym doesn't list all non-normative sexualities, such as pansexuality and asexuality, it's commonly used in sexuality studies, and the additional non-normative identities tend to be included in the plus that we see. So queer has a historically derogatory kind of connotation for sexual minorities, and to this day it remains a contested term because of this history. But some non-heterosexual people have reclaimed the term, in part because it's more fluid than lesbian and gay, and some people therefore prefer identifying as queer rather than gay or lesbian or bisexual. But it can also be used as an umbrella term for non-heterosexual people. And the reason for using queer quite frequently in this talk is also because some of the people I will be talking about didn't have the vocabulary to say lesbian and gay and bisexual, but identified somewhere on the non-heterosexual spectrum. So it's also to keep in line with them. I'm also going to, at some point, refer to an outdated term, and this outdated term does not reflect any of my personal beliefs or worldviews, but it relates to the historical period that I will be discussing, and I will also mention when this term comes up. Additionally, and finally, dozens of books have now been written on this time period and on LGBT people in general, and also on Jews, and some work on LGBT Jews. And I don't have time to kind of cover all of it because you could have multiple PhDs just on this topic. So I hope that you will consider this talk a bit of an introduction to Jewish modern history, and that it might inspire you to do some more reading and research on your own after the talk. So having said that very long introduction, let's get into it. So John Boswell wrote in his book, Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality, that the same laws which oppressed Jews oppressed gay people. The same groups bent on eliminating Jews tried to wipe out homosexuality. The same periods of European history, which could not make room for Jewish distinctiveness, reacted violently against sexual nonconformity. The same countries which insisted on religious uniformity imposed majority standards of sexual conduct, and even the same methods of propaganda were used against Jews and gay people. Much historical research agrees with this statement. LGBT people and Jews indeed share a long history of stigmatization, discrimination, harassment, and prejudice. LGBT Jews specifically have a very long history of being harassed and persecuted, but they also have a history of being equality-seeking individuals. And today I'm going to provide an overview of LGBT Jews in Germany and England in the 20th century. I'm going to divide the talk into 3 parts. In part 1, I will talk about the work of Magnus Hirschfeld, whose work was central to the development of sexual research and theory. Then I will talk about the Nazi persecution of queer people and also the aftermath of the Holocaust. And finally, I will discuss social justice activism between the 1970s and 90s in England, which includes establishing helplines for LGBT Jewish groups and Jewish responses to AIDS, and also ordaining the LGBT rabbis in England. And then in the end, we're going to have about 10-15 minutes for a Q&A. So part 1, the gay capital of the world, Weimar, Germany. In 1871, Germany introduced paragraph 175 of the German Imperial Penal Code, which criminalized sex between men. Female homosexuality was not outlawed, mainly because women were not considered sexual beings. Having said that, many places recognized and in some cases celebrated queer people. In Berlin alone, there were up to 80 gay bars and 50 lesbian bars that were mostly safe from paragraph 175. And as a result of this, and also queer magazines and theater plays and movies, Berlin was nicknamed the gay capital of the world. And whilst Berlin was the center of the queer community, with the rise of literacy and printing, and communities started sort of spreading across the country. So there were multiple queer magazines where people could find events, they could read things about their own kind of these coming out stories, people when they realized that they were queer or how to present in public as queer, places to buy clothes and much more. And there were also multiple movies with queer representation. I'm not trying to come with some sort of an idyllic image of Weimar Germany. Prejudice against same-sex attractions very much existed in Weimar Germany. Many citizens disliked the increased visibility of sexuality in media and daily life. Additionally, the queer community was largely dominated by middle-class interests and often excluded the voices of working class, especially working class, gender, non-conforming sex workers, and people who had a criminal record. And for trans people specifically, there was a very big focus on them having to pass. That means that a trans woman should pass as a cis woman, and she had to fit into society without really drawing any attention to herself. But one person who had a significant impact on queer people's lives in Germany, especially before the Nazi Party gained power, was Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a key advocate for decriminalizing homosexuality. And he was one of the key sort of sexual researchers in Germany. So Hirschfeld was a German sexologist whose pioneering research became central to queer, especially trans people. He was one of the first people to call for the decriminalization of homosexuality, arguing that homosexuality was natural and innate. He funded the world's first LGBTQ+ organization, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, in 1897, which aimed to decriminalize homosexuality and debunk homophobia through rational and scientific research. The petition to decriminalize homosexuality was unsuccessful, but it was supported by thousands of people, including lawyers, doctors, and civil servants. A couple of years later, in 1919, he then established the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. And through his practice, he provided people with a vocabulary to describe their gender and sexual identities. This includes coining the now outdated term transvestite in 1910 for people who identify as trans. So he made a very important distinction in terms of gender and sexuality, in that previously some people assumed that people who presented different to the sex that they were assigned at birth were very gay, to put it in quotation marks. And he introduced the gender spectrum category to the conversation rather than just looking at sexuality. This institute offered a variety of treatments, including sex education, counseling, contraception, hormone therapy, hair removal, and towards the end, the first gender-affirming surgeries. At its prime, the Institute saw more than 20,000 people a year, and it was one of the few places that employed trans people. He believed in the importance of offering support to everyone, so anonymous donors contributed greatly to the clinic, which means that treatments were either low cost or no cost. And in addition to being a doctor, he was an activist who fought for LGBT rights. As mentioned, he actively campaigned to decriminalize homosexuality, which he unfortunately didn't achieve. But one of his greatest successes was ensuring that trans people in Berlin could dress in a gender-affirming manner in public and in the workplace. Previously, trans people could fear getting arrested because of how they dressed. And essentially, trans people could come to Hirschfeld, who would issue a diagnosis as a transvestite, and then they could go to the police office and get an ID that said they were transvestite, which got stamped. And if the police then stopped them on the street, they could show their ID, which meant that they would not get arrested. Although now, talking about it, saying it out loud, it naturally sounds very outdated and problematic. But at the time, it really did provide trans people with some safety to have this ID card. Hirschfeld was, however, continuously subject to threats and violence from right-wing people. And this only intensified with the rise of the Nazis, who claimed that he was the embodiment of being un-German, and he was labeled as one of the leading Jewish criminals. In 1933, the Nazis ransacked and burned down his institute. More than 20,000 books were burned, and thousands of pictures and documents were destroyed. It was, in fact, one of the first places subject to the Nazi book burnings. They also took the Institute's list of clients, and they arrested thousands of people on the list because of their queer identity. Hirschfeld was abroad during this event, and he never returned to Germany. because of his identity as a gay Jewish left-wing academic. Notably, he never formally came out, but it was well known that he was attracted to men and that he had male partners, including Li Sutong that we see on the picture here, and Carl Giese. Indicatively, Hirschfeld's work and activism is important to our current understanding of sexuality and gender. Many people wonder how LGBT experiences would have been if the knowledge from the Institute hadn't been burned down. And while some things are now outdated, the legacy remains important. I don't want to paint some sort of glossy image of Hirschfeld either. He was ruthless at times. He's known to have threatened with outing people who didn't sign his petition to decriminalize homosexuality. And he was also a supporter, like many people at the time, of eugenics. And because so little was known about gender-affirming surgery, the trans people who did go to have surgery done with him risked their lives if they underwent these treatments, which at times was fatal. But he wasn't the only Jew involved with the queer community. There were plenty of queer films that were directed by queer Jews, and multiple queer Jews were important to the queer movement in Germany, which meant that by the time that the Nazis gained power, some utilized anti-Semitism and homophobia to remove and destroy queer communities by claiming that queers and Jews were bad for German traditional values. This was evident in parallel discussions on sexology and race theory because, as will be evident in a couple of slides, this will have a significant impact on LGBT people's lives in the 20th century. So I'm actually going to go some centuries back to demonstrate just the significance of it. Jewish men have a very long history of being feminized and viewed as being deviant. We can trace this history back to the 13th century, where some argued that because Jewish men were circumcised and many were Talmud or Torah scholars, which resulted in often their wives being breadwinners, many Europeans saw Jewish men as a third sex, which they claimed to be being pseudo-females. So when European sexology then developed, some Jewish men, regardless of their sexuality, were seen as being homosexual, and thereby as being perverts and criminals. Jewish and homosexual men were often seen by non-Jewish Europeans as being gender benders who had feminine bodies, as being hypersexual, queer, perverse, and weak, which threatened both the Victorian gender order, and later, for race theory, it contributed to the view that Jewish men were part of an inferior race and subhuman in Germany. This was further aided, as Freud argues, by the fact that diasporic Jews were already seen as being queer in Europe, and with this idealization of the Aryan race, Jewish men were racialized as being the other, and for some, they internalized this anti-Semitic view, and it became impossible to separate questions of homosexuality and questions of Jewishness, which someone like Freud later suggested could lead to internalized homophobia, a homosexual panic, and hysteria. And despite the fact that the first 2/3 of my talk focuses more on German society, this focus is not completely relevant just to Germany. Conroy did a case study of a British man named Simeon Solomon, who was a member of the Arts Elite, and he was arrested in 1873 for attempted sodomy, and he spent 32 years living in hardship and poverty in Bloomsbury and Holborn, unable to secure a living solely because of his Jewish and homosexual identity. But the clearest example of the negative effect of the interconnectedness of Jewish race theory, eugenics, and sexual science is the Holocaust, where millions of Jews and LGBT people were, among other population groups, persecuted and murdered. Part 2, persecution by the Nazis, the Holocaust. So, in terms of LGBT people and the Holocaust, the Nazis condemned homosexuality. The party's ideology included the perpetuation of the Aryan race, which was incompatible with non-heterosexual relationships according to Nazi ideology. Some Nazis, like Heinrich Himmler, believed that Jews and LGBT people were inferior humans. So as I mentioned just before, 3 months after Hitler became Chancellor, students from the National Socialist Student League stormed the Institute for Sexual Science, where they attacked staff and smashed equipment. And later that day, the SA continued the destruction. Hirschfeld was, as I mentioned, he was abroad at the time and immediately went into exile. But this event was then followed by more ratings of LGBT meeting points and the shutting down of gay journals, which included the Freundschaft, which translated into English is the friendship, and Frauenleben, which means women's love. For the persecutors, identifying LGBT people was sometimes harder than other stigmatized social groups. Jews often had to state their religion on birth certificates and census forms and governmental records. Communists often had a party membership, etc., whereas many LGBT people were less visible. And then in 1934, the Berlin Gestapo instructed the city police to send them lists of suspected homosexual men. And the Gestapo used the term homosexual, but they really target anyone who was not completely heterosexual, being men, that is. And in 1935, paragraph 175 was made stricter, and it outlawed any contact between men that could be construed as sexual. During the interrogations, the accused men were often forced to name their sexual partners, which would mean that they implicated more men. So during the Nazi period, about 53,400 men were convicted under paragraph 175. And of these, 5,000 to 15,000 were sent to concentration camps, where about 55 to 60% were murdered. The Nazi persecution of LGBT people was in many ways limited. It barely extended beyond Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, in contrast to that of Jews who were persecuted across Europe. And paragraph 175 didn't extend to women. The Nazi jurists considered criminalizing lesbian acts, but some argued that intimate relationships between women were more difficult to distinguish from friendships than those of men. Some people also believed that female homosexuality didn't pose the same threat to society as male homosexuality. Female same-sex behavior was never outlawed, but it was nevertheless stigmatized. Even prior to the Nazi regime, for many people, it went against social norms and gender ideals, such as motherhood. In the concentration camps, homosexual men were identified by a pink triangle which was sewn onto their uniforms. And the pink triangle was, interestingly, often bigger than any other identification triangles or stars. Multiple accounts from survivors recall that men with the pink triangle were treated worse, both by guards and other inmates, than any other prisoner groups except Jews. They were often referred to as the 175ers or filthy queers, where they had to sleep with their hands outside of their covers, and in some camps they were isolated from other prisoner groups. In Auschwitz, Birkenwald, Sachsenhausen, and Mauthausen, they were often given the worst and physically harshest jobs. The Nazis believed that they could re-educate homosexual men and believed that labor-intensive work in cement plants, brickworks, and gravel pits could turn them into real men. The Nazi scientists and doctors also conducted various medical experiments on homosexual men because they believed that they could find some sort of a cure for their sexuality. And these measures included the use of psychotropic drugs or injections of hormones or vaccines. From 1942, concentration camp commandants had the power to order the castration of pink triangle prisoners. So the pink triangle is, as a result of all of these things, associated with one of the highest mortality rates in the Nazi concentration camps. An estimated 55 to 60% of these men died, whereas the mortality rate for political prisoners who were also imprisoned for re-educational purposes was 40%. So I'm going to mention a couple of case studies here. Two of them are not Jewish and one of them is Jewish, and it is important to kind of look at some of the differences that they experienced because of their Jewish identity, which is why I'm going to talk about these multiple case studies. So one of the people who experienced these conditions of the pink triangle was Joseph Kohut, whose story was one of the first and few first-hand accounts from this prisoner group. And he published it under the pseudonym Heinz Heger in 1971. Kohut came from a well-to-do Catholic Austrian family. And although he wasn't Jewish, his testimony is important to understanding queer experiences. In 1939, he was convicted under paragraph 175, where he was sentenced 6 months in prison. And in January 1940, he was then transported to Sachsenhausen, where he was assigned hard labor in a clay pit. He recalled in his book how gay men and Jews were targeted by the SS and the capos and other inmates, and they were subject to systematic and systemic violence, where they were verbally and physically abused and tortured daily. Then in mid-1940, he was transferred to Flossenburg, where he remained in inhumane conditions until mid-1945, when he was liberated and reunited with his mother in Austria. And after his liberation, he was stigmatized from his community, which meant that he didn't talk about his experience for almost 30 years. Another one was Frederick Paul von Großheim, who was also not Jewish, and he was born in Lübeck in Germany in 1906. And in 1937, along with 230 other men from Lübeck, he was arrested by the Nazis under paragraph 175, and he was sentenced to 10 months in prison at this point, where he wore a uniform with the letter A, which I hope it's okay on a recording to say it, meant Arschficker, which in English is translated to Arsfucker. And in 1938, he was then rearrested and tortured, where he at this point was given an ultimatum between being sent to a concentration camp or being castrated, and he chose castration. And as a result of that, he was then declared unfit for military service when World War II broke out. So far, all of his experiences have happened before World War II officially broke out. And then in 1943, he was again arrested, and he was sent to Neuengamme concentration camp, where he was classed as a political prisoner due to his involvement with sort of anti-war behavior, working against the Nazis, and he wore a red triangle. And after World War II, he settled in Hamburg, where he didn't talk about his Holocaust experiences until 1991, when he featured in the film We Were Marked with a Big A, which was screened in 1993, and he died 10 years after this. Someone who was Jewish was Freddie Hirsch. And Freddie's story is one of the few stories that we know of openly gay Jewish men, precisely because of his involvement with children who were able to tell his story for him. So he grew up in a small German city that had little anti-Semitism before the Nazis gained power. And he was an athlete who was born in 1916, and he was training for the Olympics in Germany as a gymnast. But he was unable to go to the Olympics in Germany because of his Jewish identity. So after the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, which defined German citizenship, amongst other things, and also banned interreligious relationships and marriages, he moved to Czechoslovakia, where he continued working for the Maccabi Hatziah, which was a Zionist sports group. And he worked with children and sports, where he, amongst other things, organized sports events such as the Maccabi Games. Some of you might have heard of the Maccabi Games that are still happening now. And he could have left for Buenos Aires with his brother, but due to his Zionist beliefs and his commitment to helping orphans and children, he decided to stay in Czechoslovakia. And then in Prague, he led the Hagibur Sports Center for children after the children were no longer able to attend school because of their Jewish identity. He was one of the first Jews to be deported to Theresienstadt in 1941 when he was 26. And his leadership and organizational skills meant that he was able to organize activities for the younger children, which was not banned by the Nazis because they believed that these activities and his sense of discipline could contribute to maintaining some sort of order in the ghetto. In fact, he had multiple good relationships with some SS guards because of his personality, which resulted in him securing slightly better conditions for the children. In 1943, at the age of 28, he was then deported to Auschwitz. And originally he was sent to the Theresienstadt family camp block. And in this block, people kept their civil clothes and they were not shaved. And at first he was appointed capo, but he denied to use violence. So he was seen as being unfit for being a capo after about a month. But instead he secured that block 31 was the children's block for anyone under the age of 14. And he oversaw that barrack and this block. Here, the children received education such as German, history, and Jewish classes. They also learned essential hygiene skills, which were vital to surviving in Auschwitz. And they had choir and performance practice as well. They played games, they were painting and drawing, and they had some competitions, really just in a way to make the children forget where they were. And about 500 to 600 children went there during the day. And he managed again to secure that the children got slightly better food conditions. For example, as morbid as it can sound, the children could sometimes receive leftovers from packages to dead people. Hirsch was arrested because of his Jewish identity, but he was out as a queer person in Auschwitz, when most people knew that he had a male partner in the camp. He died in 1944, but his life is remembered especially because he worked with young children, some of whom survived and were able to tell his story. His life is vital to remember because of his courage and commitment to supporting children, but his heroic commitment has also been, according to Kemper, undermined because of his queer identity. And according to Haikova, Hirsch was subject to excessive homophobia, which is also not always mentioned when people talk about him. He was often made fun of because of his effeminate ways, and male teenagers were often told not to be alone with him because homosexuals were cast as being pedophiles in a way to make them deviant. Although paragraph 175 didn't apply to women, a number of gay women were still convicted and incarcerated by the Nazis, and both in prisons and in concentration camps. Some were persecuted on the basis of their multiple identities, such as being a Jewish gay woman, and others were arrested on the grounds of other sex laws, such as the age of consent law, which was gender neutral. However, most sort of Iran gay women were not targeted unless they were also a criminal or a communist, but being Jewish was really a key factor. One well-known case is that of Elsa Conrad, who was a businesswoman and an owner of multiple lesbian bars in Berlin. She was arrested in 1935 and she was sent to Morgiden concentration camp in 1937. And some scholars argue that her Jewish identity was central to her persecution because she couldn't be convicted on the basis of paragraph 175 alone. Then in 1938, she was released when she agreed that she would go into exile, and she moved to Nairobi in Kenya. The pink triangle was reserved for men. Most of the known gay women in concentration camps wore a black triangle, which identified asocial people. Asocial is a very vague term, but it was primarily used for unemployed, the homeless, sex workers, and gay women. And these women had a similar stigma to gay men. They were often met with prejudice, and they were often described as being strange, abhorrent, revolting, perverted, and corrupt. Despite the Nazis' defeat in 1945 and the liberation of most prisoners from concentration camps, numerous pink triangle men were transferred to other prisons. Sex between men remained criminalized until 1967 in East Germany and 1969 in West Germany. And it wasn't until 1995 that paragraph 175 was fully removed from the German Penal Code. In 2002, convictions for homosexuality during the Nazi era were annulled, but unlike other prisoner groups, gay victims didn't receive compensation for another 15 years. Due to the stigma and shame attached to same-sex attractions, many survivors couldn't return to their homes and families, and many didn't feel that they were able to talk about their experiences. As a result, these accounts are crucial to history and they have to be told. And finally, I turn to part 3. They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. Post-World War II queers in England. So far, my talk has obviously focused on Germany, and it has for a couple of reasons. Firstly, for the importance of Berlin pre-Nazi Germany in terms of being the so-called gay capital in Europe, and the significance of the Institute for Sex Research. Secondly, my examination of the impact of Nazis demonstrate how everyday life for queer people drastically changed and the aftermath of it on especially gay men. But in my last part of my talk, I focus on England for a couple of other reasons. I don't have that much expertise in modern Jewish history in Germany, so I don't want to make some assertions that I wouldn't be able to talk about confidently. But my expertise lies in more recent history and contemporary life in England. And also because England has very different World War experiences than Germany. So immediately after World War II, Jewish women were more likely to be married than non-Jewish women. This reflected British domestic values, the immediate post-war Holocaust years, and the creation of a Jewish home. Davis and Jennings argued that there was a considerable sociocultural pressure that resulted in Jewish British women's main role following the war was to be a mother. Many women married young, including Jewish women, which might have meant that they haven't really had the time to explore their sexual identities and attractions. And whilst others married because they believed that it could kind of cure their same-sex desires. But outside the home, Jewish women also had some different experiences than those of men. Jewish men often worked in more sort of all Jewish workshops or banks, whereas women often had more contact with non-Jewish neighbors, and they played an important role in the synagogue. And following the war, many queer Jews who were synagogue members often identified as single in order to avoid homophobia. But then in 1972, Beit Chaim Chadashim was the first LGBT synagogue which was funded in Los Angeles. And in the following decades, many LGBT synagogues were formed in Canada and the United States, which allowed more people to come out as being LGBT in non-LGBT synagogues and in different countries, such as in England. The post-war years and even decades are interesting from an LGBT Jewish perspective because, as Rainbow Jews writes, 50 years ago, being Jewish and LGBT meant that you were invisible and unwanted. Over time, wider social changes, as well as shifts in the thinking of progressive Jewish communities, have enabled people to embrace their Jewish LGBT identity. Female homosexuality was considered an inversion in England, but it was similar to Germany, never criminalized. Male homosexuality, on the other hand, became illegal in 1533, and it was decriminalized in 1967. So despite never being criminal, female homoeroticism and homoromanticism were invisible, which meant that many women repressed their sexuality. This
Mia, sorry to interrupt. I'm just letting you know you've got a good 5 minutes left. So keep going. You're in good time.
Great. I have 3 slides left, so that should fit well.
Excellent.
This compulsory heterosexuality was in part due to the expectation for women to become mothers, which was heightened in the post-war years. From a Jewish perspective, this was especially important due to the emphasis on Jewish motherhood and the Holocaust. For example, Jess Joseph, who is a Jewish lesbian, recalls that the label lesbian was just not possible. I was Jewish and born in 1960, 15 years after the Holocaust, after the Second World War had ended. So it really just wasn't in my vocabulary. But two important movements started changing this and made it easier for people to be LGBT and Jewish in England. One of them was the Women's Liberation Movement, which challenged, among other things, the nuclear family and the way that women were perceived by society. Many influential feminists, including Lynn Siegel, Harriet Richard, Erica Berman, and Nira Yuval Davis, were Jewish. But unlike the American movement, the British feminist movement was primarily secular and wasn't overly concerned with transforming Jewish religious rituals and practices. On the contrary, British Jewish feminism was primarily a response to Zionism and religion, so they were more concerned with developing a more secular Jewish identity. Indeed, Jen Bourne recalls that during the 1960s and 70s, Jews formed the backbone of the women's movement, certainly in the USA and the UK, but we weren't there as Jews. We were feminists who just happened to be Jews. Our Jewishness went unarticulated and unsung. Similarly, Eli Tikva-Sarah, one of the first lesbian rabbis or openly lesbian rabbis in the UK, experienced that the feminist sisterhood accepted you if you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and not if you were Jewish, because there was anti-Semitism within the movement. And then in 1972, the world's first LGBT Jewish organization, formerly known as the Jewish Gay Group and now known as the Jewish LGBT Group, was established. And the group was primarily led by gay men. For example, Ed Teeger, a bisexual man, said that he didn't always feel that he could participate in the group because he was married to a woman. Peggy Sherwood, a lesbian, added that she was, for some time, the only woman attending the group. The group became more gender inclusive in 1987 when it changed its name to the Jewish Gay and Lesbian Group. And during this period, it lobbied for ordaining queer rabbis, which included Lionel Blue in 1981 and Sheila Schulman and Eli Tikva-Sarah in 1984, who experienced homophobia both during and after their rabbinic training. During the 1980s and 90s, they also focused a lot on AIDS. AIDS was, and to some extent still is, taboo and stigmatized. Indeed, some refer to it as a plague from God. Many families who might not have known about their son's sexuality suddenly discovered it because they got sick, which was often accompanied by shame, fear, and guilt. But most progressive Jewish synagogues adopted the reform approach in the US and emphasized the need for pastoral care, loving kindness, and visiting the sick before the AIDS stigma. And gradually, more Jewish gays and lesbians joined progressive synagogues. The lesbian and gay pride and Section 28 are also relevant here as my final point. From the 1980s, there became an explicit Jewish presence at the lesbian and gay pride. Lesbian and gay pride marches were growing in the UK, which gave LGBT Jews a chance to gain more visibility. The Jewish Gay Group had a bagel and cream cheese stall, and they had a banner, and they promoted the lesbian and gay Jewish helplines. The bagel stall attracted many people, and some joined precisely because of the conversations that they had there. But in 1988, Thatcher implemented Section 28, which prohibited promotion of homosexuality by local authorities such as schools. And the law was abolished in England in 2003. Most Jewish progressive Jewish communities condemned Section 28, which contributed to making progressive communities more LGBT inclusive. To this day, England doesn't have any designated LGBT synagogues, unlike the US, but BKY, a liberal synagogue, was created by Sheila Schulman in 1990 as an all-embracing liberal Jewish community, which attracted LGBT Jews, Jewish feminists, interfaith families, converts, and patrilineal Jews. Having said that, Sarah argues that liberal Judaism in Britain has taken the lead in the progressive Jewish world regarding the inclusion and equal treatment of lesbian and gay Jews. Presently, it's estimated that 20% of progressive rabbis are openly queer. And after progressive Jewish synagogues began holding same-sex blessing ceremonies in 2005, they actively campaigned for marriage equality, which was legalized in 2003. in 2013. The progressive Din, unlike the Orthodox, recognizes same-sex relationships in LGBT families in England, and many now mark Pride, they mark Trans Remembrance Day and World AIDS Days, and they recognize LGBT Jews on Holocaust Memorial Day. So in this talk, I've addressed a fraction of LGBT Jewish historical events and important people. I've discussed the queer community in Weimar, Germany, and the role of Magnus Hirschfeld. I then provided some insights into queer Holocaust history and experiences. And finally, I just addressed some post-war queer Jewish experiences in England. It's my hope that this talk has served as hopefully a good introduction to queer Jewish modern history, and I hope that you might have learned something new. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mie. I'm sure everyone is clapping in online and remote fashions. That was an excellent talk. You kept to time and so much fascinating detail that I really wasn't aware of. So thank you so much. Are there questions from people in the audience? We've got a few coming up in the chat at the moment, so I could begin with those. I'm unable to see them quite. So one of them coming in from Pete Sims, and Pete asks, how can LGBTQ plus groups best support Jewish people in your opinion? So any thoughts on that, Mie?
So there are a couple of LGBT Jewish organizations in the UK now, which includes the LGBT group that I mentioned just before. And there's also Harassed UK, which is a great educational resource. They go out to organizations, they go out to schools, they have many important conversations with rabbis, where they go out to different synagogues and talk to rabbis, and well, not just rabbis, but also people who are involved with synagogues professionally. So people who teach Cheder, so helping with, for example, B'nai Mitzvah, on vocabulary, on ensuring, for example, that non-binary Jews can have an affirming B'nai Mitzvah that follows their gender identity. So that's definitely an organization that I would get in touch with. Alexandra writes that Harassed is absolutely wonderful. I completely agree. Everything that I've ever done with them has been so thoughtful and incredible. In terms of another one is that Masorti Judaism has a dedicated LGBT network, which is for all Masorti Jews who identify as LGBT or also allies. They do different events, learning experiences, picnics. I think they're going to Pride in London in a couple of weeks, so that could also be a great place to go. There was briefly one for women and non-binary Jews called Leviot, and they're not active anymore, but they still have information on where to get in touch with them, and they can help guide people. And lastly, JW Free has a group for LGBT Jews between 18 and 35, I think. And again, they do plenty of amazing events for young people.
Thank you very much, Mie. That's really, really comprehensive and really important stuff there. There's another question here from Fatima, and she has said, and you didn't mention any specific literature around, I'm guessing the question came in, I think, while you were still talking about the persecution of queer people during the Holocaust. Where could Fatima start in terms of literature on this? What's accessible? What's kind of giving a good overview in that field?
So I'm going to find a link. Anna Haikova, who is basically the leading scholar in this, has made a website where she's collected hundreds of articles on this field, and I'm going to find it as we're speaking. So that's definitely a place to start. And then the other book that I would really recommend is called Gay Berlin, that came out like 5-6 years ago. So it stops around the time when the Nazis gained power, I believe. So it's really about like the whole Weimar period and being like the gay capital of Europe, and then what's about to happen when the Nazis gain power. Let me just find that website while I'm at it.
Yeah, that's great. That would be really helpful if you could get that into the chat there. I think that seems a really useful site that would be helpful.
If I can find it.
Yeah.
This is again one of the things that I keep talking about, how there's not like that central place for LGBT resources. Here we have it, I think. It's called Sexuality and Holocaust.com. So they have things here. And lastly, with the thing that I'm currently developing, I'm going to actually present it tomorrow to this panel that needs to evaluate these Holocaust entrepreneurial ideas. But I have a collection of biographies written by Holocaust LGBT survivors that I'm also just going to quickly list. 1 second. It has like a small summary of.
Yeah, thank you. That's come through. Gad Beck, yeah, Heinz Hager that you mentioned. Yeah, that's really valuable.
And for movies, there are these ones here. Bent is a play as well. I would definitely recommend reading it as a play. It's a very touching story about a gay man who, I mean, it is fiction, but based on the Holocaust, and a gay man who gets arrested, and he hears from people on his way to, I believe it's Dachau, that being gay is like the absolute worst thing that you can be. So he ends up saying that he's Jewish instead. And then he experiences the concentration camp as a Jew while denying, when he is not a Jew, while denying that he's gay, and these kind of identity experiences that he has of these intersecting identities.
Thank you very much. That's really, really comprehensive. So hopefully Fatima and anyone else who's interested in researching more can copy and paste all that stuff out of those the chat into their own documents and pursue those ideas. There was a question here from, well, it's more of a comment that from Barbara, who says that her mother was a German Catholic, her dad was a Polish Kindertransport refugee here in 1939. They were both born in 1924, and she remembers her mum telling her that she didn't understand what being a lesbian was. And I was quite struck by the similarity with a comment that was made in your paper about the word lesbian and the use of the word lesbian, and some other work I was reading recently in queer oral history to do with the word lesbian, and not people rejecting that word, which I thought was a word that was quite accepted. And you know, I know that the word queer is less well accepted by certain members of certain communities, but lesbian I thought was quite accepted, but I've seen that being rejected. And it seems that terminology and language around identification is so important. And I was very interested that you took that right back to Magnus Hirschfeld, and I think you said he gave people a language to talk about their own experiences. I mean, how can you say a little bit more about those words and those labels, and how they fit into this story, really? Because I thought that was, you know, there's some interesting connections there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, by coining, for example, transvestite, which, as I've mentioned, is a very outdated term now, he allowed people who really felt wrong in their own bodies because they identified in a way that wasn't the same as what they were assigned at birth to have that language. And what is interesting is that we can trace that all the way up to now. So sometimes I've worked, for example, in my research, I have a couple of participants who are trans, who grew up in Hasidic families where they had never heard the word trans, they'd never heard the lesbian, gay, bisexual, any of these words, and how they started learning about them. So one of them learned about it from watching an episode of Friends where Ross's father was, I haven't watched the episode myself actually, but something about Ross's father and his gender identity or something along those lines. And just a sense of not having a vocabulary to express what he really felt and what she really felt. And now that sense of, we can keep seeing how that vocabulary hasn't changed, but at the same time, I see it more in very religiously observant communities now, because we are spreading the words into our communities, and people now grow more up with words like lesbian and gay being part of their everyday language. But I think it was interesting what you just said about the word lesbian, because there's such a changing discourse around lesbian now. There was a documentary on Channel 4 called, I think it's something like Where Are the Lesbians, or What Happened to the Lesbians, that came out last year, about people increasingly using the word queer or bisexual and not using lesbian, and the relationship between that and sort of feminism, and how these words keep changing depending on where we are in our social communities and social time.
Yeah, really interesting. And there was another comment. Thank you. Yeah. There was another comment from Owen here. And Owen says that there was a sense in the 80s and 90s that London was the queer, or at least gay, capital of the world, which, there's a nice, interesting resonance perhaps with what you said about Berlin. And he says that the rise of recent rise of hate crimes, particularly towards trans people, there's obviously a concern there that different forms of homophobia or queer phobia are proliferating. And I think he's just asking for your comments and your thoughts on that in relation to your research, for Jewish queer people and more generally.
Yeah, I can definitely see transphobia, homophobia in general rising again here in the UK, and the impact that it has on especially Jewish people, because there's also a rise of anti-Semitism. So if I knew more about other religious communities, it could be interesting to compare if it's sort of just mainly happening in Jewish respects, or if there's a similar thing if we compare it to people who might experience Islamophobia or any other types of discrimination, honestly. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, that sense of double discrimination, which is something that I've also seen in my work with people who grew up feeling relatively safe in London as a queer Jew, and now starting to feel unsafe because of this double identity and not really know what to do. Some people have even started questioning if they should migrate to Israel, like if they should go somewhere else, because they're concerned about where things are going in terms of anti-Semitism and LGBT phobia.
Yeah, it's worrying. It's that complexity, isn't it, of the multiple identities and the multiple issues that the multiple hatreds that evokes among people, certain people. And I think that that's sad times sometimes. Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to have to wrap us up there because we've gone 6 o'clock. As mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Hannah's going to send out the recording of this paper tomorrow along with a short survey. So if people in the audience would be willing to complete that survey, and Hannah's going to put that into the chat now, that can really help the Holocaust Centre be able to ensure that these events function in the best possible way. And Hannah also asked me to remind you all that there are many excellent events hosted by the Holocaust Centre North and jointly with the history department at the university, and they're coming up in the academic year. So keep following us on Twitter and on other social media to see what's happening. But most of all, I'd like to thank Mie for this really excellent talk. I think your research is wonderful, and I learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure everyone who's listening did. You presented it brilliantly. Thank you as well to everyone who's come along here tonight to attend the event, to participate in the questions and to support the event. And thank you to Hannah for being in the chat and for doing all of the technical support this evening. So I'm sure everyone is joining me once again to say thank you very much to Mie. We're all clapping electronically